All right. I think we are live. We're live. I always wanted to say that. I don't think I've ever done a live stream before. So this is a first for everyone. So thanks for joining our event, Anthos Multi-Cloud Multi-Cluster Management. Plan for this event is to keep it pretty loose and pretty live. We don't like to kill people with PowerPoint at Arctiq. So we're going to try to give you a few slides to set the context of what's going on. And then we're mostly going to give some live demos. We love giving live demos. The team's been working really hard on building stuff. So we might as well show it off. And the whole kind of vein of this event is to show you what's possible with Anthos and let the team show off some of the stuff they're doing. So plan is I will do a quick little intro and then we'll get into the good content that we have set up for you. And I've got some of my team. I guess maybe give a quick wave, guys. I got Jenn, Tim, and Aurora with me. Well, I'll let them properly introduce themselves in a few minutes here. I see people are starting to come into the room, so maybe I'll stall and tell what story would I have to tell. I guess I'll tell the story of my background. This picture is from Google Next last year. We were fortunate enough to be able to do a demo. Shay, who's not here, but myself at the developer keynote, and we snapped a pretty cool picture. I might have overlaid some other photos on this background, but unfortunately, we all didn't get to Google Next this year. We had some really cool demos planned for the event, and we're going to use some of the content that we built for that, and we'll show it off to you here. The other plan is we're going to start running these every 2 weeks. Notice Jenn popped off. She's back on. We're going to start running these every 2 weeks. The next couple are going to be focused on Anthos and Google Cloud, and then we're going to start to bring in some of the other community partners so that we can show you some of the integration possibilities and things like that. So without further ado, let's get into it. You guys ready? Silence is assent, I guess. So I'm your host, Kyle Bassett, one of the partners at Arctiq, and I'll give you a quick review of the agenda. So Arctiq's services focused partner, most of us are out of Toronto, but we're kind of spread across Canada, and we're lucky to do a lot of global work. Obviously, a lot of that work's done remotely, especially in the time we live now. I have a lot of flight credits piled up that I'm eventually going to be able to use up. But we work closely with Google on their emerging tech and other kind of cloud technologies. We're very involved in the open source community, and we love to share the knowledge. So we'll do a quick introduction of Anthos. I'm going to rip through a couple slides just to set the scenes. We're going to dive into the technical presentations. We're watching for Q&A, so I see some comments in here. Love to answer questions, so put them in the channel, and I'll try to interrupt the presenter at the right point in time to get your question answer. Otherwise, we'll put them at the end. We'll wrap up with some remaining Q&A, and I might have a special guest coming today if he or she is able to make it. So we'll see how that goes. Obviously, we're streaming on YouTube, so lots of chats. And as my kids say, please like and subscribe for content. So as I mentioned, we've been working with Anthos for a while. We were really fortunate to be able to get involved with Google a couple years ago and be able to jump in early. So we originally were the design partner who helped develop and kind of build GK on-prem and bring it to market. Since then, obviously, Google got a name for this product. It was for a short period of time called CSP, but then Anthos came to the table last year at Google Next. And since then, it's rounded itself out with way more than just a straight up Kubernetes platform. So it's a full stack. It's a full set of services, and it's very much a multi-cloud hybrid play. And all things Google is you're not just stuck to Google. You can run this on-prem. You can run this in other clouds. You see I've got an AWS logo. Azure's been announced. Recently, bare metal support's been announced. So Google keeps just ripping out the things that you guys asked for. So, when you're talking to us, let us know what you want to see, and we'll pass it on. And Google's been very quickly. So you'll see things like service mesh has come into play. Anthos config management's a huge piece of it, the whole GitOps approach to doing things, and that's very much part of our demo. And then as you move up the stack, you're going to start to see things like Cloud Run, a lot of CI/CD integration. So this event is very much focused on the infrastructure and all the automation capabilities, the multi-cloud stuff. As I said, next event, we'll get that out in 2 weeks, and it's going to be very much focused on more of the developer experience. Just teeing up like what Anthos is. Obviously, the Kubernetes piece is kind of table stakes. Everybody's running Kubernetes. Kubernetes won the orchestration race, scheduler race for Kubernetes, which is awesome because I think we bet on it pretty early at Arctiq. We've been doing the Kubernetes thing for a while. And then I said, as you move up the stack, we get into Istio, which is Anthos Service Mesh. You get into projects like Knative, which is Cloud Run. So you'll see all these are built in the open source community and then productized by Google. If we look at what are we trying to solve here, and this is overlaid from top to bottom. At the very top, it's Kubernetes. It's this multi-cloud focus platform, run anywhere, have this common experience. Infrastructure extraction is really important, and we want to be able to build and deploy applications and not really care where they're running and have this common approach, common pipeline to all these things. Declarative is going to be very much part of the talk track today. I know Tim and Jenn are going to very much focus on Anthos config management, policy management, things like that. So you'll hear how you should not be getting your fingers into production clusters. You should be checking stuff into Git repos and getting peer review and pull requests. There's nothing better than seeing your code get checked into master and rolled out across all your environments. And then it really moves into the CI/CD story and things like Cloud Run, intelligent defaults, and what are people trying to do? They want to write code, they want to commit, build, deploy, run, and do it all over again. And in many cases, not have to talk to any humans. We still like to talk to humans, but these are the components of Anthos. So very left is, the whole policy management, Anthos config management story, your whole declarative GitOps approach. Obviously, we've got GKE and we've got Kubernetes, the service mesh. There's a lot of capabilities coming into the marketplace and being able to deploy Google applications that traditionally only ran in cloud. So think of AI, ML, Vision API services, things like that. Now you can run these things on-prem. So if you have Anthos, you can very easily deploy. And then what would it be without day two ops and logs, metrics? I know Jenn's a huge fan of logs and metrics. She'll talk to you at hours about all these cool things. So Stackdriver and the monitoring service is pretty awesome. I will introduce our speakers, I guess, or I guess I'll give a quick introduce himself when they do the presentation, but we've got Aurora is up first with the demo. Then my business partner, Tim, is going to dive into, or Aurora's going to talk about multi-cloud and show you some AWS pieces. Tim's going to jump in and cover the Anthos config management policy controller. Basically, he's going to put a bunch of policy in place that will make developers' lives painful if they don't follow the rules, in short. And then Jenn's going to finish up with building configuration validation. So, the whole config validator pipeline is not just for applications, it can be for your infrastructure too. So just show that off. All right, without further ado, I am going to throw it over to Aurora, and let me put her screen up. Oh, let me add it back. So I'm a rookie still at adding this, working this tool. So, all right, Aurora, over to you.
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, I'll walk you through how you can get your Anthos on VMware and AWS managed using GCP console. Before we start, a quick introduction about myself. My name is Aurora Lee, and currently at Arctiq, I mainly focus on networking, cloud infrastructure, and some Kubernetes platforms. I have been working on project deliveries with some enterprise customers. And this is also my first time doing a live stream, so a little bit camera shy here.
We're all going to get tattoos after first live stream.
Nice. All right. So before we dive into the demo, actually, I want to show you the architecture of Anthos on AWS first. There are two main components. First is AWS cluster, and also Anthos management cluster. AWS cluster is where you have your Kubernetes control plane and also AWS node pool where your workloads will be running on. Anthos management cluster, on the other hand, is where you can deploy your AWS clusters and also doing installations and updates as well. And also you can spin up other AWS clusters from the same management clusters. And also AWS Network Load Balancer is in the architecture because it is fully integrated with your AWS cluster. You can really benefit from this integration when you're trying to expose your services to external. Also, another important piece here is GKE Hub. This is how Google Cloud can see your AWS cluster. So it does all the cluster registration here. And from user's perspective, you can see everything on GCP console. And similarly, for Anthos on VMware, we do have also two main components. First is the admin cluster and also user cluster. User cluster is where you will be running your containerized workloads and services. And admin cluster is the base layer where you can spin up your user cluster from. And similarly, you can have multiple user clusters as well with the same admin cluster. Another really exciting feature is Network Load Balancer. This is also in the architecture. So with the bundled or integrated load balancer, you can actually bring the cloud experience to your data center. When you are trying to expose your services externally, everything is automated. And also GKE Hub is here for cluster registration as well. All right. So I have prepared actually two clusters already, one on AWS and the other one on the VMware environment we have in our lab. And if you're wondering how I deployed them, this is the screenshot. So you can see how complicated it is to deploy a user cluster. This is the command line I have to run for Anthos on VMware. And similarly, this is the command I ran for Anthos on AWS, and that is it. All right, that's enough introduction. Let's jump right into the demo.
And Aurora, how long does it usually take to provision these clusters in various environments once you've got the base admin clusters up?
For me, it varies from 5 to 10 minutes. Sometimes it depends on the environment, how busy they are, but usually it won't be longer than 15 minutes.
All right, that's awesome. People, I think our customer base in the enterprise is used to waiting a little bit more than 10 to 15 minutes, but we're here to cut down that time, obviously.
Yeah, just a little bit more than 10 minutes. All right. So first, I would like to show you from CLI commands of all the components we have. First, I will switch to the context for cluster on AWS. And here I'm using a jump box because all my nodes are private. That's why you will see a proxy setting.
Do you want to maybe explain what the context is, like use context? Everyone might not know that that trick, a little trick in the book.
Yep, context is basically you have your kube configuration files where you can define different contexts. And in this way, you can easily switch back and forth between different clusters. So what I can do is show the context I have. Sorry.
Got a 0 in there.
That's why I prefer copy and paste. So as you can see, I have two clusters that's in my context. And if I want to communicate with my AWS cluster, I'll need to switch to this context and run some commands. And when I'm managing the VMware cluster, I'll need to switch to this context to run some commands there.
Cool. Yeah, I think future events we can dive a little bit deeper into identity and access management and how to integrate this into things like Azure AD and GCP. I know we've done a lot of work in that space. So obviously for your enterprise customers, you want everything to be backed by your Active Directory account or something like that. So that's totally possible.
Yep, definitely. So I'll continue with some core components I would like to show. So here you can see the nodes for the AWS cluster. So all these nodes are actually AWS EC2 instances. And we can also see some default pods. So this -A represents all the namespaces. These are all coming with the AWS cluster installation. So if you have been working with GKE cluster, some of the components might be really familiar to you. And also, let's take a look at some default services as well. Cool. Now let's switch context to see some components on VMware.
I probably noticed Calico in there for the networking side. You got Core DNS. You'll recognize a lot of these services. Obviously, there's an AWS EBS CSI driver in this environment that can, lots of different storage providers are supported on Anthos. Probably another good topic for another demo. I'm giving my team lots of things to start to think about for the next event.
Awesome. All right, so let's switch context to the cluster on VMware. And let's see the nodes. There are 3 nodes right now running for my user cluster, and these are in our lab environment on VMware. And similarly, we can see the default components as pods.
So these nodes that Aurora just showed you are just virtual machines running on the VMware stack, and she has 3 just to be a nice person, not to use up all the lab resources, but you can certainly scale these up and scale them back down.
Yep, definitely. And also we can see the services as well. All right.
And obviously the IP address range you're noticing there, 1096, is just something we chose, but that could be anything inside your network, anything you want to use.
Yeah, so this is our lab network. So all the IPs are actually private IPs. I'm using VPN to connect to our lab. All right. So next, let's see how GCP console can help us with this. So I've shown you all the information, and I want to get the same information with just a few clicks within GCP console. Let's browse to GCP console. And let's go directly to the Kubernetes page. From here, we can actually see I can actually see all the clusters that's under this project. That's because I am actually an admin of this project, and IAMs can be enforced here as well to determine what kind of access you can have here. And let's also do a filter by labels, because I have labeled my clusters as demo clusters. So here it is. Yeah.
I noticed you got one thing to note there, you got an upgrade available too. So you're able to see when upgrades are available on the various cluster environments, gives a little bit of information. So we're obviously on 131, or 131 just came out. We were on 130. So another nice little feature inside the console to be able to manage your upgrades.
Yep, definitely. So back to the list, we do have the cluster on VMware, and we also have the cluster on AWS, as you can see from the provider label here. So let's dive into one of the cluster. and see what we can see here. So all the details about this cluster is actually here. You can see the name, endpoints, and type versions as well. We can also drill down to physical nodes and click into one of them and see all the pods that are running currently on this node. The resource summary, the condition is also here. And we can also see the details, including labels, annotations, and all kinds of status here.
Yeah, so that's a nice feature for people who want to, be able to give some access to your team to be able to view this. That saves an awful lot of kubectl commands to pump out all that info of what's running on the clusters.
Yep, exactly. And also events can be seen here as well, if there are any. And following the same steps, we can browse to our other cluster as well. This is on VMware. We can see all the details, the physical nodes. We can also go into the nodes, see the same details here. All right, this is the physical layer. Now let's jump to the workload page. Here is where we can see the actual workloads, not only for different nodes, different namespaces, also the different clusters that you have access to. And we can also do a filter by cluster names and namespace as well, so that you can have, for example, you can have a better view here.
So you see the GK Connect agent there, everything's deployed essentially as an operator on the platform. So all the pieces that Google's shipping with Anthos runs on the cluster, and you're able to kind of interact, but you don't have to look after the deployment and the management of all that. That's part of the value of Anthos being packaged up for you.
Yep, exactly. Awesome. Now let's take a look at the service and ingress page. Here we can see a list of all the services that's running on your clusters. It will also show you the network endpoints, namespace, and cluster it belongs to. And we have some other pages, including configurations, where you can see all your config maps and secrets, and also storage if you have any attached to your cluster. As you can see, all this detailed information about multiple clusters in different environments are aggregated and presented to you in the same manner. I believe this makes operations team to operate multi-cluster much easier. And also for development team, they can have a very granular tool to view about the Anthos platform as well. All right, now it's time to do some real deployment. So there are a lot of ways we can deploy applications to Anthos clusters. What I'll be showing today is to deploy an enterprise application using Marketplace. So if you haven't heard of or used Marketplace, Google Marketplace offers deployment templates so applications can be launched quickly to the destination environment. All the solutions in Marketplace is vetted by Google team for security vulnerabilities. And also in terms of commercial applications where you have to purchase license, procurement and billing process is also built in, and it's making the process really easier and smarter as well. So today I will choose to launch one of the application, which is called SonarQube. This is a security tool which can manage your cluster to find bugs and vulnerabilities in your cluster. So Google is doing a really good job here to provide all this information and documentation for this deployment. Let me
So the idea here is Google's going to certify these applications. I mean, many of them are open source based, but there's also vendor based applications that could get deployed. And the nice part is you can get integrated billing. So you can pay for the application based on the time you run it. So I think this will be a new trend in how people consume software for sure, is to be able to do it through a marketplace and be able to just add it on your GCP bill.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm doing, what I'm going to do right now. So I'll configure this application to deploy to my cluster on VMware first. And we can create a new namespace for this and do the deployment.
So you're deploying this on the AWS cluster, Aurora?
This is on VMware, and I'll also do it on AWS as well.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we're using GCP Marketplace to deploy an application to AWS. Who would have ever thought this would be something we would be doing?
Yep. All right, so this deployment is complete, as you can see from the status, and you can also see the components here, what's being deployed to the cluster as well. Let's start with, let's deploy the same thing on the AWS cluster. You can configure this to our AWS cluster into a new namespace and deploy. So from here, you can actually see the progress and steps for this application to be deployed. And that is complete as well. We can also go into one of the deployment and see all the details you can get. So we do see pods are running here, services are here, and everything is linked as well. So you can just click into whichever resource you want to take a look.
Yeah, the other cool part about this is it's mounting persistent volumes in an automated fashion too. So you're getting storage mounted at the same time as you're deploying these applications, and it's being managed.
Yeah, everything is all bundled together and integrated. So if I do a search here, I will see
Yeah, well, when the last time you got a volume pass to you in about 3 seconds?
This is really cool. All right.
So I think that deploys like a whole Postgres database and a PV.
Yeah.
I think that's
exactly. Let me go over to their documentation, see what's being deployed. So from the design diagram, we can see in the Kubernetes cluster what's being deployed. First, we have a stateful set of the application that's running. And we also, like Kelsey said, we do have a Postgres SQL as well here. And we also have PVs to support this application. But actually, the information I am looking for is to see how users or web client can access this application. As you can see, we're using a service called SonarQube to access this application. If you have been working with Kubernetes services, you might know that there are different types of service. Cluster IP, which is only exposing your service to internal of your cluster. So if we want to access this application today, we will need to change the service type from cluster IP to load balancer. And let's do that in GCP console. Let's go to the service page and do a filter.
I was expecting you to go wrangle some YAML for that and get to your copy paste, but I didn't. You're gonna be able to do this through the console. That's nice.
No, we can just go directly here and do an edit. It will take us to the YAML page, and then we can do a quick change here.
So still YAML, but pre-formatted, validated YAML. So exactly. I guess that's the best we're going to get for now. But we're getting closer to not having to deal with YAML.
Mm-hmm. So here we are using static IP. So I will need to actually assign an IP here and save. This is on our VMware cluster. And we'll do the same on AWS. I'm going to change this to load balancer. And I'll quickly show you what's going on the back end. So from AWS console, you can actually see a new load balancer that's created with the DNS name and the classic type. And we can get the same information in GCP console as well.
Aurora, I saw a question pop in. Do you want to go back to the console there for a sec, the AWS console?
Yep.
Maybe just show the EC2 view. There was a question on the nodes you were showing that were just the worker nodes. So this is obviously there's an admin cluster here. Do you want to just talk to that quickly? It looks very much like the GCP or the VMware environment. Sorry.
These are actually the EC2 nodes for the AWS clusters. So you can see in the architecture, we do have the control plane. And also the management cluster right now is running on this node. I'm also using a jump point here as well. So all the nodes are here, as we can also see from the GCP console as well.
Cool. Yeah, and I think in another session we can show auto scaling and adding more nodes and all the orchestration around that as we get a little bit more time.
Yeah, definitely. So let me just quickly click to the application. So this is the one. As you can see, this is the IP I just assigned to our VMware node, VMware cluster, and this is the DNS that's assigned automatically.
Awesome. And no logging into VMware or kubectl commands were performed in that demo. Love it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll need to cut it short and stop here. But as you can see, Anthos is a really great tool to manage your clusters in different environments. And yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
Cool. Awesome, Aurora. Thanks. Yeah, shoot the questions through. I know probably put a blog out on this and keep sharing the knowledge, but there's a lot of power with this setup clearly. All right, I guess up next is the infamous Tim Fairweather to talk about ACM Policy Controller. So I think we'll just keep plugging away here. Tim, over to you. Good job, Aurora. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks, Aurora. Thanks, Kyle. I'm not sure about infamous, but we'll work on that. Depends on how this demo goes too, I guess. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'm going to do a demo and a quick walkthrough on Anthos config management, policy controller, and how this really applies to multi-cluster management. So, kind of an extension on what Aurora is talking about in terms of being able to deploy clusters in multiple clouds, multiple environments is how to manage that at scale, get consistency at scale. And so I'll walk through some of those components and kind of lead into Jenn's demo. And I'm not sure why that's not flipping, but there we go.
Okay,
cool.
I'll put it full screen for you.
A little bit of an intro. Okay, cool, perfect. So a little bit of an intro for those that don't know me. My focus here at Arctiq is really kind of all things microservices and cloud, I guess. It's kind of become a pretty big bucket. Spending a lot of time in pipeline and workflow development, which I kind of view as an extension of automation, and kind of front and center on building out a bunch of sort of the technical validations within the Anthos stack. So it's been a couple year road here, and it's been a fun and exciting journey, kind of being able to help and also kind of watch the progress and the development that's happening in these spaces. So,
not to mention,
the main theme for my part here is Yeah, definitely. No more flights right now. The idea here is managing multiple clusters across different clouds difficult, or isn't it difficult? And there's an argument to be had for it can be difficult, right? As much as we can dive into GCP console, we can edit things, we can manage components, deploy things from marketplace. doing things like that at scale can be a little bit of a daunting thing. So, kind of this idea of, rolling out, applications, policy, standard configurations and things like that at scale can be a very difficult thing. And more importantly for me is getting consistency in that. A bit of OCD on my side. I'm a big stickler for consistency. I'm not a fan of snowflakes, and certainly want to keep consistency as I'm rolling things out. So enter Anthos Config Management Policy Controller. I'm going to keep the slides super brief. We can do lots of follow-up and all that good stuff, and happy to answer questions. But ideally, we're talking about 3 different components here. Config sync is essentially our ability to configure a Git repository that all of our clusters are going to pull their configuration from and sync those into the cluster. Policy controller, which is our ability to define standard policies, things that our users and application teams, et cetera, are allowed and not allowed to do inside the cluster. And then lastly, config connector, which allows us to do native GCP-based configuration from the cluster's perspective. We're going to hone in completely on policy controller as a part of the demo. But ultimately, kind of the same thing applies in terms of everything is applied through this centralized Git repository. So the real value here, the real plus for me, is this ability to have one single central repository that can host all of my configurations for all of my clusters, regardless of where they live, regardless of if they're deployed on AWS or in VMware or in GCP for that matter. Being able to define that in one location is a massive endeavor, in the sense that now I don't have to go and find configuration information. I don't have to go to the hunt, and that's the real core value here. So all of our clusters are going to pull from that central Git repository. There's a few things we can do to manage and control what things get applied where, and I'll go through that in the demo as well. From a pure sort of use case here, multi-cluster administration really comes down to, we generally have an ops team or multiple ops teams or whatever the case is, that they care about things like security policy, they care about network policy, resources, and access control. Those are the things from an operational standpoint can be a bit of a daunting task inside of Kubernetes when I'm trying to do this at scale. Aurora showed a couple of clusters. I'm going to show 3 clusters. What does this look like when we have 100 clusters? Do we really want to go in and manage each one of these components individually? I would argue no. Mostly from an admin and management perspective, I'm a bit of a lazy admin, call it efficient, but either way, I just don't want to have to go in and manage these individual things in each one of these clusters. And then dev teams owning apps that run on the clusters. So we're not really going to talk about application deployment from this perspective. We're going to focus solely on the operational side of this. So the idea here is single source of truth, multi-cluster installs. So it's a coordination of a few components that make up Anthos config management. And I'll show you these pods when we run into the demo as well. But the idea is these pods orchestrate with each other to apply consistent change across these clusters. One of the things I'm going to highlight in this demo is, kind of in this diagram here at the very bottom, and it's the coordination between policy controller and GKE. And there's a layer in between there, the admission review process, that is the admission controller side of Kubernetes. And so the idea and the core sort of fundamental difference between policy controller and other implementations of security controls and things like this is this lands in the admission controller plane from a Kubernetes standpoint. What that ultimately does for us, and I'll showcase it in the demo, is this isn't about catching changes. This isn't, or catching, breaches in policy or something like that. This is about just quite simply not allowing them. Because it's at admission controller level, the admission controller sits within critical path between a user or a piece of software trying to apply change to the cluster, and quite simply will block that change request as policies are broken. And so it's less of a sort of, let things happen and go on the hunt later to kind of find out who done it. It's more about let's block it right up front and just not allow it to happen. I'm going to dive straight into demo as promised. There is 0 slides to death here. So I'm going to showcase a little bit of sort of what this structure looks like. First, we've got a couple of clusters, 3 clusters to be exact. I've kind of framed it as like a prod cluster, a dev cluster, and what I've got called SB cluster here, a sandbox cluster. Whether or not that applies to anybody's environment is up for question, but the idea here is to kind of showcase a little bit of a difference in terms of how we would handle these clusters. And one of the things we're seeing here with this nomos status command is, and just to maybe preface, the nomos command is the CLI utility for Anthos config management. And effectively, that's using my kubeconfig. So some of what Aurora was talking about there with contexts, it's referencing my kubeconfig to discover the 3 clusters that I currently have configured for access. It's giving me a layout of whether or not my policies, whether or not my actual cluster is in sync with my Git repository. My last sync token in that next column is the commit string, so the short form commit string that the cluster is currently synced to. And then the sync branch. So this is another sort of capability for us to be able to separate and control what clusters get applied where. And very purposely inside of this demo, I've got the prod cluster synced towards the master branch in this Git repository. And I've got the other 2 clusters, dev and sandbox, synced up to a dev branch. There's lots of ways in which this can be configured in terms of making sense for a flow or a management strategy or whatever. But ultimately, this is a pretty common pattern where we've got multiple branches to sort of separate this. One of the bigger advantages to separation like this is we've got a capability to work this into our actual Git branching model. So if I've got protected branches like master or something like that, I can enforce the policy of having pull requests done on a feature branch before things get applied to our live cluster. So, it's seamless in terms of this applies to or starts to take shape like what a development workflow would look like. And really no difference other than this is really an operational focus. And if we have a look at the 2 branches I have in here, I've got a master branch and a dev branch. And this is, like I said, where these clusters are synchronized to. And if we have a quick peek over at Cloud Shell here, and just have a look at things like this. So I talked about this last sync token. So I can see my prod cluster here with its last sync token of 292.19f at the end, and head over to here. We got 292 right here. So we've got the latest commit here. And to me, this is a nice feature to be able to see where my clusters are currently configured to. So there's very little guesswork involved. So it starts to take shape like something I can gain consistency from. If I'm going to, add a new cluster, I can just register it up to the same branch. And now this cluster looks the same as the rest of the clusters that were applied to this, this exact branch and this exact commit as well. So this applies to, 1 cluster, 3 clusters like here, or, it could be 300 clusters. The idea here is I'm managing from one spot, and that's now in Git. The development world has been used to this for a little while. I would say the operations world is getting used to it, and there's lots of workflows that are starting to be, more supportive from a pure, operations workflow inside of things like Git. But ultimately, this is sort of where things have headed, and kind of where things are. And so what I'll do is, aside from just doing that pull request right there, I'll show you a little bit of actual policy control area in action as well. So one of the things that I'll show you is we have right now, my current branch is sitting at the dev branch right now. My dev branch is ahead by 1 commit from my master branch, which is, what a traditional workflow would look like. If I've got production registered against my master branch, I'm likely going to have a dev branch or some other feature branch that I'm applying and testing changes to without necessarily applying to prod right away. And the idea here is if I dive into some of the repository configuration here, it's a fairly straightforward structure here. So I'll just do a quick overview. Inside the repository, we have a few high-level folders. We have a system folder, which is reserved for system artifacts here. In our case, it's a repo manifest that ultimately defines the config management structure. Then we've got namespaces, under which we've got the capability to apply namespace scoped objects. So these are things that would apply inside of particular namespaces, including the definition of the namespace itself. So the idea here is we've defined a namespace here called random Giphy. It's got a label here for Istio injection. And in an Istio world, this allows us to make sure that this namespace is going to have every single pod injected with a sidecar for Istio support. Then we go up to the cluster folder, and the cluster folder is, as you might guess, where we hold anything that's cluster scoped. So things like custom resource definitions, RBAC policies, like things like cluster roles, cluster role bindings. Effectively, anything that's cluster scoped, we'd host in this folder here. In our case, we're going to host some policy controller elements, and I've got a couple of ones in here already just to shorten up the demo so that we could show you more. And the idea is we also have this capability of a cluster registry. And this is sort of the other component to config management and policy controller together, which ultimately allow us to do things like cluster selection. So one of the things that I'll walk you guys through here in this quick demo is this idea of cluster selection. So even though we might have multiple clusters configured to sync from a particular branch in a particular repository, we are always going to have use cases where we only want to apply certain configurations to certain clusters, even though they might share that same repository configuration. And that's where cluster selections come in. So I'll show a quick demo of that as well. So just to show you a little bit of sort of config manager or config management and policy controller in action, I'm going to show you one baseline policy that I've got put in place here. And this one is a fairly standard policy that I would see in things like, multi-tenancy environment, where I want to be able to restrict and control things to run things safe. In this case, this is straight from a template library, but, applied and reconfigured here. And I'll show you some of the parameters that we can change. But ultimately, inside of PSP allowed users, this policy, we're defining a policy that says our containers cannot run as root. And by doing our change here or our policy here, we're basically saying we're only going to allow pods to run with user IDs in the range of 100 and 20,000. So, our root 0 is user ID 0. So this blocks us from being able to run pods as root. We can set things like excluded namespaces, which I've done here. So this gives us the ability to kind of say, hey, we've got this, special workspace over here or a special namespace over here that does need access to be able to run as root. We can allow that within policy controller. And then all we do is we basically specify things inside of these parameters that get passed to the custom template. We could run a whole other event on how to actually write policies and things like that. There's a fairly complex language underneath the hood. But the idea is this language is used to be able to pass parameters that would then get applied to our cluster to control what can run and what can't run against our cluster. So what I'll do is just do a quick test here of this particular policy here, the allowed to run as root policy. I'll just show you briefly what that policy looks like, or sorry, what the config is going to look like that we're going to try to apply. Here we're going to try to apply an Nginx pod definition here. This pod spec is also going to have a security context definition that says run as user root. So we're effectively going to try to force this pod to run as root. One of the things that you'll notice here is when we go back to this no root policy, there's no other exclusions in here. So we're excluding namespaces. We're not saying we're going to tag this for particular clusters or anything like that, because very much on purpose, I want across the board, across all three of these clusters, to be able to block the use of root to run containers. And so if we have a look at our dev cluster right now, which is the current context I'm in, so we can see that here, and do a quick apply here. And where am I? That is a different folder, so I should have had that staged. So there we go. So I'll run the no root apply here. So effectively, we're going to attempt to apply this pod that has a root specification. And we can see here the message coming back from our gatekeeper pod, which is sitting at the admission controller webhook level. So we can see right away that we're getting our message back here that's saying this isn't allowed. And this is that admission controller process that I was talking about, where the value really here is that I quite straight up get denied. There's no way around this. And the idea here is I've got no way to kind of bypass this unless I make changes to policy. So this isn't even something that as an admin or cluster admin I can bypass. Technically, I'm running these commands as cluster admin. So it's even further evidence there's really no way to bypass this. The only way to bypass this from a cluster admin standpoint is I could delete this policy. The other interesting part of this, though, is this cluster is registered against Anthos config management, against a Git repository. So as soon as I delete it, that syncer pod is going to come into play again and resync this policy back again. So it is pretty strong in terms of the protection. And this applies to all of the clusters. So let's just do a quick switch over to prod and try to apply the same thing. And again, we're getting blocked here. So it kind of does showcase that we've got consistency across all 3 of these clusters via simply this one Git repository with this one policy definition in here. And we can kind of craft and sort of change this policy as we see fit. One of the other things that I kind of wanted to showcase here is this idea of cluster selection. So yes, it's all well and good that we can apply policy this way and we can block users from doing things that they maybe shouldn't do. But also, how do I make sure that I can bypass these restrictions for particular use cases? So I might have a cluster as an example that maybe doesn't really apply for a particular policy. So I'll show you one here. And this idea is another policy called K8s required labels. And this one is one where we're defining a particular policy that says a namespace must have a particular label in order to be a valid namespace. And the use case here inside of our policy is we're saying all namespaces here have to have a label set for prod or dev. If they don't have a prod or dev label set, then deny it the same way as we've denied this root user request as well. And so ultimately we can define this and we can apply it to all of our clusters. The interesting part about this one here is I've got another annotation, and the annotation I wanted to show you is the cluster selection side of things. And so we're basically saying we only want to apply this particular policy and sync this from an ACM perspective to clusters that are marked as this particular cluster selector. And I'll show you just real quick how this kind of all comes together. We have our 3 clusters defined inside of cluster registry. I have my prod cluster, I have my dev cluster, and then I also have my sandbox cluster. And so the idea is each one of these defines a label, and this label has environment equals something. So for sandbox, I've got it as an environment for SB. For dev, however, I've got it as environment prod. And I've done that very much on purpose because both the prod clusters and dev clusters are actually labeled as prod from an environment perspective. And the use case here is in many cases we see where customers want to treat their development environments as production. I mean, this kind of idea of, developers without things to develop against, become non-efficient, to say the least. And so, the idea here is maybe we want to tag our development clusters as prod so that we can apply policies to them that make sense in line with what we would want to apply for things in prod. And then lastly, we define the actual prod selector. So selector env prod, and we do a match label. So this is how we're actually doing the selection process. So you can see how this kind of fans out in the sense that I can have many clusters labeled as the same label and effectively be able to control what clusters get certain configurations or policies applied. And then I've got my SB selector here. And this is my sandbox. So we can see the environment is labeled as sandbox here. And so where these selector env for prod and selector for sandbox get used is when we actually want to apply a cluster only to a particular set, or apply a config only to a particular set of clusters. Maybe 1 cluster, maybe 3 clusters, whatever the use case sort of dictates. The other sort of function of this, and I'll just show you sort of how this relates to Git, is when we have a look at our Git branch here. Oh, I'm not in the actual repository, so that would help. So the actual Git branch here is dev. So we're looking at our dev branch here. If I have a look over at dev here, we can go in and we can see here that from a cluster standpoint, we're actually targeting that one policy. So we can see this here in a dev branch. So we can see it just the same as we see it in my editor. So this is pushed up into Git. So my clusters have this particular config. If, however, I switch over to master, we can see that that policy doesn't exist in master. And so this is sort of the idea of how this fits into a Git flow as well. So we can sit here and we can go new pull request, and we can say, hey, we want to compare our dev branch to master, because in our dev branch, we're trying to apply this policy. And this will extend very well into what Jen's going to show you next in terms of building this into a pipeline. But the idea here is we can see that we've got one file changed. We'll create our pull request. Have a look at the changed files, and we'll be able to see that one policy change that we're trying to add to the clusters. So from a Git standpoint, a pure Git standpoint, this now gives us the ability to put management approval in place. This gives us the ability to kind of say, hey, maybe we want somebody to kind of, approve this request, or, make sure that they're in charge of it, or whatever. It can apply to code owners instead of a GitHub, side of things. There's lots of options here in terms of fitting this into a Git model. But ultimately, what I wanted to show you is how the cluster selectors work. So if I have a look at two different things. One is this idea of, and actually we're in prod right now, and we got a token refresh. So one of the things is prod's going to tell us that it doesn't know about this type of resource. And it doesn't know about this type of resource because it doesn't have this constraint applied to it. If I then switch over to Sandbox, and we got a token refresh on this guy as well, and we switch over to the Sandbox one, we're going to get a very similar error here. And the idea here is the Sandbox cluster doesn't have this particular cluster selector here. So lastly, I'm going to flip over to my dev cluster that I know has this config, and I'm going to do the same describe here, and I'm seeing token refresh. And when I do this describe in the dev cluster, the biggest difference here is because this one actually has the configuration, both because of this cluster selector and the fact that it's in a branch that is being pulled from this cluster. I now have the capability to actually see this particular element. And the last sort of component I wanted to show you before I kick things over to Jenn is this idea of not only is policy controller able to enforce policy within admission controller, but the other function of it here is this audit trail. So I can do a describe on this particular policy, see the details of the policy just like any other Kubernetes manifest. But under status, I can see violations. So I can see there are namespaces here that are currently in violation of this particular policy. And so, in particular, we've got this namespace at the bottom, random Giphy namespace that's present in our cluster because it was created before this policy was created, so it wasn't able to be enforced. And if we do a get namespace, we can see our random Giphy namespace here. But because it was created before, it was able to get created. But now with this policy applied, it's in breach. So we can see that we've got a violation of this particular policy. And so, kind of the idea is, where do we extend from here? So, a very sort of quick demo here, kind of showing the possibilities and what we can enforce. There's lots of things we can enforce inside a policy controller. But ultimately how this ties to managing clusters at scale. Like I said, this 3 cluster setup is a very basic setup. This could have very easily been 100 clusters if I wanted it to be 100 clusters. And being able to apply policies like non-root and privileged escalation and things like that at the cluster level, or sorry, at the Git level, rather than at the cluster level, and then allow that to apply to any cluster that's registered to sync against that repository. I now have what I would call, configuration management at scale with a good degree of consistency here. And this kind of ties in very well to what Jenn's going to present. So I'm going to kick it over to Jenn, and she's going to show you some more about how to extend all of these concepts into a pipeline to help you with validation and things like that. Because, the obvious next step is we've kind of done this and we've showcased it, but, how do we make sure that we get that next level of consistency out of this? Nice.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And thank you to the cottage internet gods there. They were pretty awesome. There's a bit of a delay, so I didn't get to provide any color, but that's the longest I've stayed quiet in a while. I'm impressed with myself.
Nice.
Very cool, Tim. Yeah, so I think you scratched the surface of this stuff, to be honest, right? I mean, you show what's possible, but generally when I get asked a question around config management or policy controller, can I do this? The answer is kind of always yes. It's going to take a little bit of work and a little bit of config and trial and error, but the idea is the possibilities are endless if you're willing to roll up your sleeves a little bit. Obviously, this all comes from, the OPA stuff is a great community behind it in the Kubernetes space. So we're able to share some of these configs and policies, which is really great. All right, we're going to keep plugging away. I will intro Jenn, the infamous Jenn. I guess I already called the former sysadmin Kubernetes extraordinaire Jenn is how I'm going to introduce Jenn. So I'll throw it over to you, Jenn, and you can, I think we already got your screen up, and you can start diving in.
Thanks. I'm not sure if I fall under extraordinaire, but thanks, Kyle. The really nice part about following Tim and Aurora is that you guys have done all of the explanations for a lot of this stuff for me, and I just get to dump into really silly slides and show you something cool.
Maybe just speak up a little bit more, Jen.
Okay, sorry. Getting used to my headphones.
Yeah. All good.
So, quick about me. I've been working with Anthos for, I guess, pre-GA. But my focus is mostly around microservices, automation, and all things configuration management. The joke about my previous life as sysadmin is I used to do things like Puppet and Chef and Ansible and all of that. So config management is right up my alley. So Tim showed you a bunch of hard work, right? We want to put some policies on. He's showing you how namespaces were in violation, all of those things. What I want to show you is how you can do that without having to go to the command line, right? And so this slide here is just that sort of a bit of a joke of aren't pipelines for developers. A validation pipeline in this case can catch a lot of those errors that could show up in your configuration management repository before they have a chance to get to your configuration management or to your clusters, right? So you can test a policy, you can do GitOps type workflow, right? This is kind of what I was wanting to demonstrate with my cloud build, right? We want to validate any new resources against existing policies, so new namespaces. But the other thing that we want to try and be able to do is to validate any new policies against resources that are already in the namespace or in their repository. So in Tim's demo, where he had that namespace that said, ran in Giphy, it didn't have any labels. In this kind of a pipeline, that would show up and say, hey, there's some things that aren't labeled and aren't going to fit properly. And so for my demo, I'm really just using a couple of things, right? I've got a couple of GKE clusters, one that's labeled dev and one that's labeled prod, very similar to Tim's setup where, my dev one in my case is actually attached to a dev branch because it's for policy development. And then I have my prod cluster that's attached to my master branch. I'm going to use Cloud Build. And I have some, voodoo with GitHub and GitHub Actions to do a bit of labeling on my pull requests and those types of things. And basically the workflow of what I want to show you is, again, that idea of a GitOps workflow. Nobody goes into Kubernetes, does anything by hand. You're going to put a pull request, you're going to branch out to a feature branch. You're going to put a pull request in. There's a pipeline that's going to get triggered to validate what you're doing. And Cloud Build is going to report back to your pull request and tell you whether the build passed or not, right? And so very, very quickly, because, it's easier to show this. So let me jump over. I'm going to show you very quickly just my config management repository. It's a little bigger than, there's a few more things in mine, but I have very similar, right? I have a couple of things, right? I have some namespace labels that have to get applied. It's very similar. But what I have in here is I have at the root of my repository, I have a folder called Cloud Build. And in it is actually my pipeline configuration information. And it's just pulling a few containers. Some of this stuff is available right on the Google documentation for Anthos. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go over to Cloud Build, which I've already set up my repository here. And I'm just going to create a trigger that when there's a pull request for my dev branch, that this is going to trigger a build. And so it's very quick, right? Give it a name. I've set pull requests specifically, not just pushing to a branch. It's connected to my GitHub repository as a GitHub app, which allows me to do pull request status reporting. I've picked my branch as being dev. And in this case, I could let this auto detect, but because I've put my Cloud Build definition file in a folder, I'm just going to specify it. I've also done a few things to allow me to use the same build file against multiple clusters. So I'm just going to fill in a few variables here. And a cluster name. Because what this is going to do as it's running is it's going to go out to a Kubernetes cluster running in GKE that has configuration management, the operator installed on it, and has a few of the policies into it. And it's going to use that as part of the build process. So it's going to, run Cloud Build's going to run some containers over there. It's going to connect to a cluster. It's going to use some tools like Nomos and a few other things to validate all of these all of these policies, what I want to put in. And the funny part is I can never remember my own cluster names. So I'm just going to do that really quickly and create this trigger. And you can see it right here now. I have, so what I'm going to do now is through Cloud Shell, I have a couple of things here. So up in one level in my demo folder, I have a namespace and I have a couple of policies I want to test, right? So the policies that I want to test, the first thing I'm going to do is apply this namespace. So sorry, live demos are fun.
Yeah, there's always an art to live demos, right, Jen? You got your copy paste ready, you got your up arrow, down arrow.
Yeah, I know. I occasionally forget. Okay, so, and I am on my dev branch. So right now my dev branch is, if I go over to my settings, you'll notice I have 0 protections, 0 branch protections. I have no requirements whatsoever, which is very similar to the way, when Tim was demoing, this is how it's set up, right? There's no preventing me from pushing to dev or doing any of these things. So I'm going to do that and push this up. Okay. And so what I've pushed in is I've created a new namespace in one of my clusters and I've put a config map in there. Nothing fancy, nothing extraordinary. I can show you what that is.
There's the old context coming in handy again.
Yeah, the context is coming in handy, but it's really weird. I don't have any namespaces. Like I just pushed that up. I really wanted this demo namespace. And so now I need to go check, right? And I have, if I were to dig through this very deeply, you would find that, I wasn't able to apply this because I didn't have any labels on my namespace. I do have some default policies in there. And this is kind of why you want to start putting a pipeline in. So let's go set it up very quickly. I'm just going to add a rule to my dev branch that says I need a status check before I'm allowed to pass. What one is that one? As you can tell, I've done this a few times so far in the last couple of days as I'm getting this set up. And if I was being proper, I would include myself in the you aren't allowed to push to master or violate a pull request, but I'm going to just do this like this for now.
I think there's a golden rule. When you're doing demos, you're allowed to push to master.
I don't want to push to master though. Okay, so now I have a dev protection, right? And I've got to require a status check. And that means, right, I can't just push directly into, that's the other one. I want to pull request view. This is just quick setup. I wanted to show setting this up because it's a few changes you need to make in your code repository environments. But now I can go back to Cloud Shell and now I want to try testing this new policy in my dev cluster. So I'm going to make a new branch. And I have a convention set in this repository for the moment for some labeling that says, I'm going to auto label certain things that are with a preface with features in them. So
I like how you're getting under the covers here, Jen, showing everybody the low level stuff.
So if I want to show what this one really is, because this one, it's just a policy that I feel I guess feel kind of strongly about, mostly because, we've been doing a lot of demos with our vault and secrets management and all sorts of other things. So if I cat this one, what it says is never, ever, ever are you allowed to have a particular key called private key in a config map, right? Now, this can be extended to a bunch of other things, but in this particular case, should we ever have a private key in a config map? I don't think we should have one in our clusters. And so I want to put this policy in. I want to test it. I want to make sure it's passing. And so
this is a great example of how security can start to get involved in the whole pipeline process. We've traditionally always written policies and documents and posted PDFs, but this is a great way to get security teams to start to build some of these policies that have to be followed. And obviously using this technique, you can, enforce them all the time.
Okay. So for now, I have a new branch over here called the feature CM policy. So I want to do a pull request. I just want to check it against my dev branch and see. So right now I applied this to my config management repository, but because none of my clusters are configured to listen to this particular branch, it's not applying to my clusters yet, which means I can go out and do this and create a pull request. And now I can go look at the actual cloud build as it's running.
And we could do a whole session on cloud build and the power of cloud build and all the integrations and things like that you can do. And obviously we've done projects where people want to build on-prem and not build in cloud. So that's something we can always accommodate.
Yeah, I did actually. Nice catch. I just saw somebody. I meant to call it cluster name, and I called my variable cluster zone. Let me go fix that really quickly.
Nice.
Yeah, somebody caught it in the.
Thanks, Wan Chin. I hope I pronounced your name properly.
This is how you make sure people are paying attention, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So, but here's the thing. I can rerun this trigger, right? So I can go over here.
By the way, none of your team caught that. So that's the best part.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just go back to here. And
you can do a rerun there.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to try and do. I can't find it.
There's a rerun in Git there right beside the.
Oh, there it is. Thanks, Tim. All right, let's try this again.
The only thing is I think that might rerun with the same vars though. But.
Okay, let's try this again. All right, this is better. We've actually connected my cluster. So you notice it's just doing part of this is it's doing a kubectl get credentials or a gcloud get credentials to connect to my dev cluster, right? It's passing around a bit of information, a kube config, various other things. Now it's what it's actually doing under the hood, and I'm gonna just very quickly go through this. It's using Nomos in a couple of steps, right? So Nomos Hydrate, when you're working with Anthos config management and policy controller, Nomos Hydrate will inflate all of the policies into what they would actually look like for certain clusters, right? And then the this other one is just sort of packaging it up, right, to be able to be read YAML. And then the one down here is the actual policy validation. So right now, this passed, and now let me try and merge this into merge my pull request. So you notice though, I have some, I personally like labels that tell me what kind of change is happening in my environment, right? And so it's telling me, it's put a little label on there and that it's a cluster level change because it's happened in the cluster folder, right? You'd probably be more granular and say it's a policy change or it's a few other things. But this lets me run a build that validates my code changes and does all of those things. And it's not even on my cluster yet. right? And so now I'm going to use my admin permissions, and I'm just going to merge this into dev, right? And so now, like the goal of that one, like I said, for me, is to make sure that teams can test policy, they can make all sorts of sort of test changes and those types of things and get the fine tuning done in a way that is non-impactful, right? You can do your fine tuning, run it through a build pipeline that vets it, that validates it against what's currently running in environments, all of those things without having to touch those clusters. And that,
and so Jen, that would end up catching the thing that I had there, right? Yeah. Where the namespaces were technically in violation, but as they're being applied before they're applied to the cluster.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just pushed the policy. I just pushed the policy. So now, if I were to go and add another config map that had a secret in it, which I can do, it would catch that right away, right? And it would catch your namespace labels. I can show you. You notice the amount of triggers that were in there. I have run, I have been testing this, and this is one of those follow your own rules. I do this regularly. So you can see over here is an example of a failed build, right? So I have a config map that has a private key on it. And it said, you can't do, this never got made it to dev. That namespace that somebody tried to submit, and then somewhere a few bit down, I have a build that says, so this, you notice how like Tim showed you the audit event. Well, I put a label or a policy in that said a label had to look like this as an email name. I had to have a user that matched my email address. And it actually came back and said, all 5 of these namespaces would be in violation if you did that. And so that lets me take the time to maybe work with someone else and fix this versus pushing this through and causing a bit of a cascade problem where I have audit events all over the place.
Sweet. That's great. Awesome. I guess for all you people out there that can't get your microservices and Kubernetes projects approved, let us do that security demo with the token being caught or secret, and then security will have some budget for you to get on this Kubernetes train. So.
Yeah.
All right. So awesome demos, everybody. Those were wicked. And I think, I don't know, I said we might have a special guest coming into here. He may be multitasking right now. Hopefully he's still online. But Kelsey, are you there?
I am here. Hold one second.
We can't see your beautiful face. I'll do I don't know if you need an intro, but we have a special guest, and he's definitely into this Kubernetes game. There we go. Hey, Kelsey, thanks for joining, man. Thanks for
what's up, man? Where you at?
Chat.
Are you supposed to be at home, man? Look at that. You out?
I was told Google Next was this week, man. So I'm here, and nobody is in this giant room. But I'm gonna.
Yeah, you gotta start checking your email, man.
Yeah, it's that email thing. I'm running. I'm on Teams or something, man. Someone put me on Teams. So getting to all my friends out there over Microsoft. But yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming by, man. We're starting to do these live events. Obviously, we can't travel. I haven't run into you. I think you and I hung out in Montreal last time, and that was before winter. So we're all stuck at home, but it's not so bad. We got to make the best of it, and we figured we'd get the team to show off some of this Anthos stuff we've been playing with.
That was an amazing live demo, by the way. I just wanted to stop and say that. Like, that level of detail and patience, thumbs up.
Cool. Wow. There.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
That feather in your cap, guys. So
thanks, Kelsey.
So yeah, Kelsey, I thought you said you'd. This was a long shot. I kind of reached out to Kelsey and said, "Hey, you're around tomorrow." He made some time to come on and chat with the community. We got quite a few people online, and we'll obviously share these demos and stuff out after. But I thought we'd just have a chat, man. You know, that's what we like to do. I think Tim and I first met you. I think it was like 4 years ago now, or probably 2.5, 3 years ago now. You came up to Toronto and did that event, and we were doing a lot of demos at that event, and you suggested, let's just do this fireside chat thing. And I was like, sure, man, let's do it. And I quickly Googled what a fireside chat was. And then, and then we had a great one. And then we did that customer event up in that room with the Jeopardy board after. And it was a lot of fun. And I've started doing those fireside chats. I've probably done like almost 20 of them now. And I love just sitting down and shooting the SHIT with people and getting some perspective. And you don't have to be planned. Let's just talk about what we think and what we know. So I thought we'd go into it. I'd love to get your feedback on how are you dealing with being home with the family. I'm sure that's an awesome side effect. I know you travel a lot, but I've sat in rooms and we've talked to a lot of customers over the years, and they asked a lot of great questions. How do you find that perspective of not being able to go to their office and, hang out with them after? And is it, how are you managing? Is it working?
Yeah, I'm fortunate, right? I work at a great company, work at Google Cloud, and I've been working from home for, the last probably 12 years of my career, 4.5 recently at Google. So this is kind of my home base as it is already. So this is my comfortable way or place where I can be productive. But in terms of family, like I'm lucky that, everyone has something to do. My wife's an administrator at a middle school, so she actually goes into the building. There's no kids there, but it gives me a little bit of freedom. My daughter's of 13 years old, so it's worked well for me. In terms of business-wise, look, we've been remote in terms of Google spread out all over the world. A lot of the open source communities that I'm a part of are also spread out all over the world. So it's been fairly easy to keep productive in terms of writing code and doing things like that. But these virtual events, you just log in and then bam, you're there, no flight. So I've been enjoying the break from the airports.
Yeah, I hear you, man. And we've noticed a lot, like, the attendance is huge. People that sign up are able to make it because, like you said, you don't have to jump in the car and go somewhere. You can, I think I missed a lot of the conferences this year because, that human touch you get when you go meet new people. I know you're super big on that, like walking the conference floor and checking out all the startups. And so, hopefully we get this back, but we all got to do the right thing, obviously. To switch gears a little bit, I think, we're talking a lot about infrastructure today and building infrastructure. And I think I've done talks before where I kind of say infrastructure is dead. So I think we all are moving more into the application space. You've obviously seen like build pipelines can be automated. You can do security checks, all that stuff. The cloud services are there to help with these kind of things. And leading into our next event, we really want to focus on the developer. So, you talk to a lot of developers and I don't think they want to be wrangling YAML and worrying about Kubernetes. So what are you hearing from them? What do developers need to really push the envelope and help their businesses transform?
It depends on how much inertia you're in, right? If you're at a company that has mainframe and they bought all the hype cycles over the last 40 years, that means you got mainframe, you got all the Sun Microsystem stuff, you got the Windows stuff, then you got the Linux stuff, and now you got some cloud. So you got like 5 of these platforms that were supposed to transform your business. And it turns out none of them will do it by itself. So now you have all this stuff. And if you're in that world with all that inertia, even the perfect platform that shows up tomorrow, you probably can't benefit from it 100% because you have all this other stuff. And no one's going to fund the rewrite to take advantage of all this new stuff. I don't think since we saw mobile, right, when the mobile platform came out, it was such a big forcing function. Like, look, if you want access to 1 billion mobile users, you have no choice. There is no enterprise, nothing. This is how it works, end of story. We don't have that for infrastructure. So I think for a lot of people, it's going to be more about what are the new patterns for security? Some of the things you showed earlier in that demo, treating policy as something that I can actually declare versus it being something that floats around in InfoSec's mind. Yeah. And I hope that the scanner picks it up. Now we can start to serialize a lot of our intentions. So I think the value now is about how fast can we take these ideas and embed them into existing systems. And I think that's what Kubernetes is about for the most part. Open policy agent in the form of gatekeeper, existing CI/CD platforms. That's really where I think a lot of developers are going to just cherry pick. If you can go all in, then something like Cloud Run becomes super interesting. If you can go all in, Spring Boot and gRPC becomes super interesting because now you can just take those frameworks and platforms and take them kind of ready to go, and you just trade off not just being able to do everything you want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, we tend to want to show off the cool, stuff. So Cloud Run, if you could start from scratch, something like Cloud Run would be a no-brainer for all your stateless stuff. You don't got to build a lot of stuff. You can, scale to zero function.
Can I pull on the stateless thread? Like everybody says, what about state? What about state? Nobody handles state well. VMs don't handle state well. Bare metal doesn't handle state well. Nothing handles state well. So it's not about serverless not doing state.
Yeah.
Serverless makes you intentional about state. It says you can't write stuff to this random disk here that you believe your RAID 6 is going to save you, because it's not. When that disk goes, so does your data. You're done probably.
Yeah.
So I think what the platforms are saying, POSIX and distributed systems don't mix, right? It doesn't. So in the Cloud Run world, it says, put it in a database, put it in a cloud bucket, put it in put it somewhere, but don't put it on this disk because it may not be here, especially if you have to move to another region. I think the thing that we've done in like the existing world, we've gotten real lazy. Some people are just, they got the hopeful infrastructure, right? There's cloud native infrastructure and there's hopeful infrastructure. And you got hopeful infrastructure when you have lots of alerts and pages, right? Because like, all right, we got these 8 servers and we bought these RAID cards and I think we set the RAID up correctly. But when this goes, you're like, damn, our RAID wasn't set up correctly. The data's gone. Go get it from a backup. That you're not even handling state well in those scenarios, because who actually tests stateful restores daily? Nobody. Right. So I don't know. I just wanted to pull on the stateless thread because people think that that's a problem to be solved. It's more about where do you keep your state?
So is that what it comes down to, right? Like as if you package up Anthos and what Google's doing with the Anthos stack is it's opinionated, like it's coming with things. And is that it? Like, let's help explain people and force them into doing things different ways so that like your stance there is true, right? Like if you're going to use Cloud Run, then put it in the right place. Like don't ask for support for PV support for Cloud Run. Like that's probably
the thing is enterprises have lots of money. And whenever you have lots of money, you can do whatever you want, right? Like, hey, I want to jump out of this airplane without a parachute. Look, sign this waiver, pay this amount of cash, and I will fly you up. And that's what you want to do. We recommend you use a parachute. But you're saying that you got a lot of money and you bought the plane, you own the pilot. Look, don't tell me you're going to jump out without a parachute because that's bad.
It's called a security exemption, right?
Yeah, like if you want the exemption, you can do you. So I think we've proven through white papers, we've proven that POSIX semantics and that stuff doesn't mix well. But look, when you have a lot of cash and you have the risk tolerance to say, look, we'll deal with backups. So Anthos is about saying, we're going to meet you where you are. So Anthos is more about reality. I'm talking a lot about best case scenario. Best case scenario is not what everyone's doing, especially in the enterprise. So Anthos is more like, we got to figure out PVs. We got to figure out local storage. We got to figure out the stuff that people are doing, whether we think it's good or bad. That's not important. It's just the reality. So Anthos to me is the reality pill for the cloud native world. You know what I mean? It's like there are stuff that you just can't do in existing environments.
Yeah, and you got someone to call, right? And it's an insurance policy to be able to call and say, I misconfigured this, or how do I rebuild it, things like that.
Yeah, and I look at it as being a little bit more prescriptive on the security side of things too, right? Like I like to think of that, active stance on security versus check this box kind of thing.
Yeah, I just hope we don't turn this into SC Linux. You know what I mean? Because I remember SC Linux was like, all right, we're going to lock it down. We're going to have all these tools. And then people was like, yeah, that takes a lot of discipline. You know what I'm going to do? SC Linux off. And somehow you still get HIPAA and PCI certification. Fact. You can get those certifications with SC Linux turned off. So I just hope that our APIs are clean and easy enough to use that people don't just go turn it off.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. We used to joke a lot about nobody actually has SE Linux on. If anything, they're reporting on it, but that's about it. But everybody shuts it off.
Well, like that's the nice part about what we demo with ACM sometime is the guy with elevated access jumps on the cluster and does a switch back, and then it changes back. Hey, what's going on? They find the wrong cluster? Why does this thing keep? I know I've got myself into runs like that before where I'm pointing at a repo and I'm making changes. It just keeps going back.
People will figure out how to turn that off too. I worked at Puppet, and that was the thing we used to show with like configuration management tools. Like, look, SSH to the server and do something, and then put it back. And then people's like, oh, but if I turn off this Puppet agent, I'm back in business, baby. And then we will go look. It's like, why is the Puppet agent off on these servers? And someone would be like, well, I had to do stuff. I was like, oh, it's not what we wanted.
We got to watch out. Jen's a big Puppet fan, and I know you are too. So we've evolved, I guess, to different tools.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to path of least resistance, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to shut things off sometimes.
Yeah. So Kelsey, I know you got about 5 minutes max. I want to end this with, I want to get some advice on doing live demos, and you've done a ton of keynotes and great things. But first, I want to tell a really cool story. So I was in Montreal with Kelsey. We did an event at this really cool place that was like outsourced. They had a marketing company set it up. Remember that, Kelsey? They did great branding. They had your pictures on the wall with big boxes and stuff. We went in, we went to demo, like awesome event, plugged the laptop in to do a test. Nothing on the screen. So you're like, okay, I'll get this tested, whatever. And then I found the hertz setting on my Mac. So I had to change the hertz to 50 hertz or something, right? And it works from the back, works in the back all of a sudden. I'm like, fine. And I go to the guy, I want to test it on the front. And he's like, don't worry, it'll work. And I go, well, I want to test. He's like, don't worry, it'll work. So then Kelsey rolls in. He's got his Pixel book. He's rock. He's got, he's minimalist. He's got laptop, a jacket. I don't even think he had a jacket, but you're like there ready to go for this event. And we had just done a similar event in Toronto. So I'm like, Kelsey, you better test your thing, man. Make sure this thing works. So he's like, all right, I'll test it. Plug it in. Nothing on the screen. So the event TikTok, right? People are like, breakfast is getting eaten. So I'm like, all right, let's start Googling around trying to change the hertz setting on a Pixel book. Kelsey's on Hangouts internally. Nothing, man. So at that point in time, your laptop did a random reboot, your Pixel book, and updated your Linux. So then you lost all your Cloud Shell, all your kube configs, everything. And at this point, you looked at me and you're like, man, sometimes like you just, the gods are telling you to not do this. And I'm like, well, don't worry, man. Like you can use my laptop. And it's like, you don't understand, man. This is a sign. So I'm like, okay. So what we're going to do is I'll do mine. We'll change the order around. We're going to fly by this. But my screen wouldn't work on the front. So I had to get the guy in the back on a Windows machine to set up a Google Hangout. Then I went up on stage and I joined the Hangout. And I did my presentation over the Hangout. And during that time, Kelsey gets his laptop back up mid thing. And he kind of signals to me. And he's ready to go. So he joins the Hangout, walks up mid presentation. They send him up with no mic on. So they had to pop the mic off, remember, tuck it in your ear, and then boom, Kelsey nails like awesome. Someone had asked you if config or Anthos is real or something, and you showed them traffic director and ACM and all this cool stuff. So it was pretty cool that we pulled that off. The marketing team at Google was fairly stressed out that day. I think we handled it pretty good. We got through it. But what's some tips? Give us some advice on.
So one thing I've learned is I don't have the device with me, but there's a device now that I carry that you can take in the conference feed and switch the hertz on this hardware device.
You bought this after Montreal.
Yeah, like don't mess around. Don't trust the AV person. They don't mean any harm, but you can't believe them because if they're wrong, it's your fault when you're on stage. I keep one of those around. I keep 2 laptops. I keep a MacBook Air and a Pixel book. But that wouldn't have saved me in that event. So you got to have that breakout box.
You left the MacBook at the hotel, if I remember.
And then also I don't stress about the demos, right? Like if they don't work, you can pivot out of them. The thing that makes demos look bad when they go wrong is you don't know when to stop. Like you should just stop. At some point, just stop. You're sweating. Your shirt is soaking wet. People are looking around like, man, I really like this person, but they should just stop.
Yeah,
they're giving you a signal that it's okay to stop and wash your hands of it. And sometimes you can just pivot. So I would tell people, if it's going off the rails 100%, there's a time boundary where you're making it worse. Just stop. Just say it should have worked, but it doesn't now. And just switch topics, right? Talk about your family. Talk about
tell a story.
Your job. Tell a story. Be out, right? So that's my only tip. And then last thing is some people ask me, Kelsey, what should I demo? And the one thing that I try to do is I try to figure out the thing that makes me smile, that makes me excited. And I try to turn that into the demo. Because if it makes you like, wow, this is cool that you can do this, typically your whole goal on that stage is to make sure other people feel the same.
Yeah, that'll really cut through. Cool. And the last story I'll tell about this epic day, the same day before I drop you off, is after the end of the day, you were with customers and you had to do a keynote at like BNC Bank. I forget the name of the bank. So we had Shruti had to pull you out of the room because you were into a great conversation. We jumped in an Uber, and then you were like, "Oh, I got to do this keynote in front of 500 people." Frig.
Remember the story was I'm bouncing after the live event. We meet with customers one-on-one for about 2 hours, in and out, in and out. And then on the way out, the team is like, Kelsey, we need to go on site to a customer. And I'm like, all right, maybe we're just going to do a whiteboard session there. I'll roll in, jump on the whiteboard. So I roll in, and it's hundreds of people sitting, looking at this stage. I'm like, what are we doing? They're like, oh, yeah, you're going to go and present. I'm like, what? So I opened my laptop.
Yeah, remember we
trying to find the slide. I was like, all right, I'm going to do a rendition of the KubeCon keynote with the hidden figures, and I'll remix it. So I'll just walk up there real smooth, put the laptop down, and then it was actually a pretty good talk. It made me feel good. And then awesome. I closed the laptop, and I was like, peace. And the team was like, damn, it don't even matter at this point.
Yeah. The part you forgot about was we had to get you've tethered off of my phone in the cab to boot up your lab environment. You couldn't get the load balancers coming up, and you had your laptop. We're heading up the escalator to the talk, and everyone's waiting. And you're like, if this thing don't come up, man, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Right before we walk in, it came up, and then it went perfect, man. That day was like filled with just trials and tribulations, but we just got through them and we just flowed with it. And we were probably both pretty sweaty, but we didn't have any on our foreheads or anywhere that was noticeable. So
yes, I am very fortunate. Hey, thanks for having me. I got to run to another meeting, man. But yeah, I enjoyed this format. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Kelsey. Keep it real, buddy. Later.
All right, later.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Kelsey.
All right, guys. So there's a surprise guest. So surprise. That's a good way to end, I think. Anyone have anything to end on? Obviously, we're going to do another one of these in 2 weeks, and we're going to focus on the developer a little bit, developer experience. I think so we got some more demos to build, and we'll probably get some more team members involved is the plan. So yeah, any closing words of wisdom, anything you didn't get to point on that you wanted to kind of push through, I'll put it on everyone. Tim, what do you got? Closing remarks.
Yeah, I think the only thing is like each one of these topics could be a session on its own, right? Like they're incredibly complex topics that, tackle pretty complex things, and, they all kind of build on each other to build the story, the whole workflow, right? And so, there's lots of areas to dive deep. We scratched the surface on a few things, and our intent is to, continue to run a series of these and, keep diving deep like this. And live demos, as much as they're nerve-wracking sometimes, they tell a good story. And the other part from our side is, and it kind of resonates with what Kelsey was just saying, is like getting behind the technology and getting behind what you're saying. This is stuff we eat, sleep, and breathe every day. So it's fun to do this stuff live.
I love his advice on just like tell the story of what makes you excited, what makes you smile, what you build, and stuff like that. Aurora, any closing remarks? How do you leave this live stream?
It's great. I did my demo halfway. I agree with Tim as well, because we are only scratching the surface. There are a lot of capabilities we can showcase on GCP console as well. And I'm looking forward to the next event.
Cool. And Jenn, last but not least.
See, when I follow Tim and Aurora, they say all the good things. But no, even like policy controller and all of these things, these are topics that I'm passionate about. So it was, with what Kelsey said, it's fantastic. And I could absolutely talk about logging, monitoring, and policy controller for hours if anybody wanted to listen.
Nice. And I guess I'll challenge any of our customers who are on this live stream that have built some cool stuff that want to come on with us. We'd love for some guest appearances down the road, so just reach out to us. And I think we're all very fortunate. One thing I always say is you generally don't want to present after Kelsey Hightower. It's always good to go before him. He's a beauty, such a nice guy, such a community guy, always willing to help out. So that was a nice little surprise guest. So I think we'll try to stick with that theme, and I'll try to get some more surprise guests for the next one. So with that, I think we will wrap. This event will be posted once it's done rendering the 1 hour and 40 minutes that we just cut through. That felt like about 10 minutes. So that's a good sign for me anyway. Felt nice and easy. I think everybody did an awesome job with the demos. Hopefully everyone's questions got answered. If they didn't, just ping us, hit us up, Twitter. I think we have email. We don't have a phone, but we'll answer your emails or come on our site. We've got like a live chat there too. So happy to answer the questions and keep sharing the knowledge. So good attendance today, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks with some new content. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
everyone.
All right. See you guys. Bye.